fortunate in South Carolina that the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, they're not as large as some of the other states are, but they're very focused. They work in coordinated teams, and they also get an amazing amount of research done. And so with that as a background, I want to introduce one of their marine biologists. Brian Frazier grew up in Maryland at Chesapeake Bay, ended up in Charleston where he did both his bachelor's and his master's degree. And for the last 19 years, he's been working for South Carolina DNR. He's joined tonight by his wife, Ann. Ann, where are you? Raise your hand.
She's hiding in the back.
She's hiding in the back over there. Make sure you say hi to Ann. They've been together for 14 years, so if Brian acts normal, even though he's a marine biologist, I'm sure it's in like my marriage, my wife is the one responsible. So with that, Brian has agreed to come and talk about not just sharks, but also the research that he's been doing and in our own backyard. So without further ado, turn it over to Brian.
Thank you for the invitation, Chris, and thank you all for having me here to do what I really love to do, which is talk about sharks. You know, I've got 40 minutes. I could take 2 hours. You know, I really do enjoy talking about it. So afterwards, if we don't have enough time for questions and you still have burning questions, come find me. So just to kind of give you an introduction of sharks as an overall group of species, they're incredibly diverse, and you know, that's what really, you know, makes them so fascinating. We have everything from sharks that are 39 feet, which are filter feeders, down to these tiny 6-inch sharks that live in a couple thousand feet of water and mature at 6 inches. They're found in both fresh and salt water, and the thing that kind of binds them is for the most part, they're apex predators, which means that they largely evolved without predation, or you know, even the smaller ones are mesopredators, so they're still more at the top of the food chain than others. So they have this life history where they're slower growing, and they generally have very few pups compared to other animals in the marine environment. And they've been around as a group for over 450 million years, so they got a couple 100 million years on the dinosaurs. I would say, you know, a lot of people like to say they're largely unchanged in that time, and that's somewhat true, but if you look at the diversity within the group of species, they really have changed and really modified themselves to fit their environments wherever those may be. So the thing that binds them is they're cartilaginous, which means they have no bone. Even their teeth are just modified cartilage. And they have 7 senses, which is actually 2 more than humans have. They have electroreception and a lateral line, which helps them tune in and find their prey. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about sharks. They can't smell blood 2 miles away, but they can smell it, you know, a couple 100 yards away, and then when they get close, they use all those other senses to find that prey. Sometimes it's buried under the sand to hone in on it. You know, so they're really using all these different senses to you know, be those top predators. 2/3 of their brain are made of olfactory lobes, which helps them with that great sense of smell. And another, you know, real characteristic of them is they have a large liver for buoyancy control. They use that in combination with their fins to keep from sinking. They can actually use their fins like a plane's wing and give them tilt. And their liver's giving them just enough lift, so they don't have an air bladder like other bony fish do. One of the coolest thing about sharks is their diverse reproduction. It's one of my favorite things about them, and we've done a lot of work with shark reproduction. Sharks are the only group of species that have all 3 modes of reproduction. So they have viviparous, which is the same mode as humans and a lot of mammals have, where they actually have eggs that are developed. As you can see right here, this is actually a black-tipped shark that was in the process of fertilizing eggs here in the oviducal gland. They pass into the uterus, and then pretty quickly they start growing a little pup, and then in the case of this particular species, about a year later, you have live-born young with a placental connection. So they exhaust this yolk, and then they actually get direct nourishment for the mother. At the same time, you have aplacental viviparous species, things like the sand tigers, the white sharks, mako sharks, and these guys don't have a placental connection, but what they have is the mother continually feeds them yolk, or these eggs here, and you can see them actually coming down. This is a sand tiger. This is probably the coolest reproduction in any species. They have what is known as oophagy with interuterine cannibalism. So what happens in sand tiger sharks is, you know, they fertilize those first few ovas and a bunch of young hatch. And whoever develops first and has the sharpest teeth goes around and eats his brothers and sisters until it's just him left. So they have 2 uteruses, and only one will survive in each uterus. So and there's actually, I didn't put it on here because it's actually a little creepy, but you can go on YouTube and find these videos, and they actually show these young swimming around with teeth in the uterus eating their brothers and sisters. Pretty cool. To me, at least. And then one of the other modes of reproduction is ovoviparous, where their young are actually born in what you commonly know as mermaid's purses, and all the nutrients they need to develop are in there within the egg case. So they have, you know, pretty diverse reproduction, and within that they actually have, within the viviparous species, they have some with gestations as short as 4 months and some with gestation periods as long as 18 months. So they really vary, and even within that, there's some that can reproduce every year, and some can only reproduce every 3 years, which is why for some species, they have a lot of trouble when they interact with commercial fishery. So here in South Carolina, you know, we're incredibly blessed with a diverse amount of sharks as well as pristine waters, you know. And within those waters, our estuaries are actually serving as nursery areas for some of these species. And what that means is they're born, their moms actually either come right into the estuaries and drop the pups off, or they drop them off near shore and the pups actually swim into the estuaries, and they spend the whole summer in here feeding, getting fatter, and eventually the water temperatures drop and they have to migrate out. But a lot of these species are actually returning the next year, and in what we call a secondary nursery, they're returning as juveniles to the same waters and using them until they grow to a certain size, and then they may migrate, they may use other areas, but most of these species are actually returning to where they were born and dropping their pups off in the same relative area, which is pretty cool. So even, you know, these small waters, as I've heard Tony has caught plenty of sharks back in here with the kids. So they use these waters, and they're back in here primarily because of food. Also, it's a shark eat shark world. The large sharks will readily feed on these newborn sharks, so they're back here avoiding some of the larger sharks as well. You know, and as we move out from our estuaries, our sounds are actually where the greatest concentrations of sharks are, all sizes, from those newborn sharks up to 13, 14-foot tiger sharks, big, great hammerheads. And they're really all here because of the abundance of food. They're doing other things that when they're here, you know, mating may occur here, they're certainly dropping their young, but food is what is really keeping those guys here. So within South Carolina, we have about 19 species that we consider to be common. You know, some of the guidebooks say there's 43 species of sharks. Well, you know, we've caught over 50,000 and we're sitting at about 21. So most of those are relatively rare, or they're, you know, sightings that were from 60 miles offshore in 2,000 feet of water. But when I talk about South Carolina sharks, I'm thinking about 20 miles offshore into the estuaries. And within that, we have about 19 species. And it's largely driven by these smaller sharks, these mesopredators such as Atlantic sharpnose. Over half of what we catch in a given year. We've caught 50,000 sharks since we started monitoring our sharks in our waters, and over half is a single species, Atlantic sharpnose. And then some of these smaller species, bonnetheads, fine-tooth sharks, which don't grow that big. They specialize in different prey. Sandbars is one of our larger ones. It's one of the few that's in trouble, although they're rebounding quickly. And then, we really drop off, and, less than 2% are these other 12 or so species. So we really have 6 primary species that are in here. So how do we sample for these guys? We use a couple different gears, and we need to do this because different sharks have different behaviors. We use gill net sampling, which is where we're in the estuaries, and for that we're primarily targeting a few species, bonnethead sharks, fine-tooth sharks, and then some of the other species. And we're doing that within small waters back in these nursery areas. We're also using a hand-deployed long line, which we basically just put 50 hooks on, and we're moving up and down and removing the sharks from it. And the primary goal of these gears is to get at long-term abundance of these sharks, because ultimately that's one of our primary goals, is monitoring these sharks, making sure that nothing's happening, making sure they're going to be here, and populations are doing well. As we move out into the sounds, we use some bigger gear. We also use a bigger long line, bigger vessel, larger hook. These are the 3 hook sizes we use. This is our one for baby sharks, or young of year long line. We use this bigger one when we're out in the sounds. And then this real big one we actually only started using about 5 years ago. And once we started doing this, we found we had some incredibly large sharks in areas that we didn't previously know. We do see a lot of shark-on-shark interactions. This is actually a 4-foot shark right here, to give you perspective there. And that great hammerhead was not to be denied. He really wanted that black-nosed shark, but we actually ended up tagging the great hammerhead. We got him close to the boat and tagged him, and he also tagged that black-nosed shark there. So 2 for 1 special. So when we're doing this, as I said, our primary goal is monitoring the abundance of these species. So we're keeping our soak time really short. We want all these sharks to survive. We get them on the boat, we measure them, we tag them with conventional tags, and then we take biological samples for different studies, which I'll talk about in a minute. So as I said, the primary goal is to get indexes of abundance, which is how many of these sharks are we seeing year to year, and over time we'll get a population trend. And this is actually just for a single species of sharks, and these are all our different gears, and we see a lot of noise, especially in, like, this is our hand line, this is our gill net. So these are what we call a recruitment index, right? So they're primarily sampling those babies. So it's not saying how the overall population is doing, but what it's saying is how many babies are born in a given year. And over time, that can give us a trend of how the adults are doing. These other gears are drumline here, which we just started, this coastal long line in green. These are more tracking the adults, so we can see how the adults do. But if you put them all together, we have a pretty good picture of how blacktip sharks are doing. And in the last 20 years, it's a pretty positive story. All of them are going up. Of course, in the early 90s, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of sampling in South Carolina during the heyday of the commercial shark fishery, when species really got in trouble. So we don't have baseline data. But what we do see is that this species is doing really well. It's recovering, which is a positive sign. So what do we do besides monitor sharks at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources? Basically anything I can get funding for. So we do a really diverse amount of work. We do age and growth, which requires sacrifice of the species, but for some of these species, we can't manage them properly unless we know how long they live, how often they reproduce, how many pups they have. It's the basic information we need to know what their productivity can be. So in order to do that, we have to sacrifice some, and this is actually a vertebrae that's been sectioned in half, and kind of like a tree ring, you can age this, and there's alternating bands that are driven by seasonal patterns. sharks. So we can age this animal, we can say that animal's 4 years old. Important information. At the same time, we do that reproduction work that I was talking about, which is, really one of the most basic pieces of information, but it's lacking for a ton of species. So we do this research, and oftentimes we're working with commercial fishermen or recreational fishermen so we don't have to kill the sharks. They're already getting killed, but we can get that information. We do a lot of work in genetics, not necessarily us, but we have collaborating partners. Some of the things genetics can tell us is effective population size, which is a different way of getting at how many sharks are out there. We can get migratory patterns. For instance, bonnethead sharks, they don't migrate past the Florida Keys. There's an Atlantic population, and there's actually 2 populations in the Gulf of Mexico. And we can tell that through genetics. We can try to get at that through tagging, but genetics gives us a much clearer picture. The Mississippi River actually divides the Gulf of Mexico, and bonnetheads don't pass that. So we actually have 3 populations of bonnetheads that don't interbreed at all, and that's something we can tell through genetics. We do a lot of diet work. And some of that can be lethal and some of that can be non-lethal, and I'll talk about one of those studies later. Movement ecology, beyond the basic information we need to know in terms of life history, the second most important is movement ecology. What areas are most important to these animals and how do they use them? And then something we've been doing more recently is post-release mortality, which is a measurement of when we catch a shark and we release it, does it survive? Because not all of them do. And in fact, some of them, species like great hammerheads, are incredibly susceptible to dying on gear just by interacting with it. There's been studies that have shown 95% of great hammerheads that are caught on a long line, even if those guys don't want to keep them, even if they're planning on releasing them, 95% of them die. And that's just through their physiology, and they just get really stressed out and they die on the line. So we're looking at that for recreational fisheries and some commercial fisheries like shrimp trawls when these animals are captured. So moving into some of the research that we've done, and I'm kind of highlighting some of what I think are the coolest stories to come out of South Carolina in the last few years. So I don't know if any of y'all have heard, but about 8 years ago, we had a new species of hammerhead described from South Carolina, and it was named the Carolina hammerhead. Now, the reason this was kind of cool is it's morphometrically identical to the scalloped hammerhead. So I can hold them in my hands and not tell which one it is. However, when you look at their genetics, there's been divergence between the two for over 100 million years, and they are as different as a bonnethead is to a great hammerhead. So there's a tremendous amount of genetic divergence between the two, yet they look identical. So we started, wanting to look at some of the questions with that and say, okay, these guys are occurring in the same area and they look the same, what's keeping them from interbreeding, which actually that's a little bit of a giveaway. We found out last year they are hybridizing, and it's unidirectional. It's the scalloped hammerhead on the Carolina hammerhead. So our Carolina hammerhead that we just found, there's selective pressure in that species may at some point disappear because the hybridization isn't going both ways. But another story. So we decided to look at their diet. And we said, okay, they're occurring in the same area. Maybe they're feeding on different things. So stomach content analysis is not fun. It's incredibly time consuming. I am glad that I have someone that's paid to do it. Sometimes you get these really pretty prey items like this, and you can say, okay, that's a decapod shrimp. That's a croaker. Sometimes you just get this whole petri dish full of parts, and sometimes you get this. These are all fish otoliths. This is a single stomach, so you can say, okay, maybe I can identify this, but then you got otoliths of 20 fish in there. So we go through and we do the best we can. We ultimately end up with a bunch of unidentified stuff. Don't worry about what's on here, but what the general results of this study were is their diet looks pretty much identical. I mean, those pie charts are pretty similar. But there's this new technique called stable isotope analysis, and basically what it is you are what you eat. It's an assimilated diet, and we can use changes in isotopes of carbon and changes in isotopes of nitrogen. So we can get at the carbon source, and as you move up through the food chain, there's predictable increases in each of these isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. So that can get us at what is the basic prey source of the carbon. So is it a benthic diet or is it a pelagic diet? It can also get us as, are these animals occurring inshore or offshore? You know, offshore would be more carbon depleted. And then we can get at the relative trophic position as well, which gives us some idea of their diet as well. And when we looked at these two species, which are little baby, newborn sharks, we found they had really different isotopic signatures. There's a little overlap here, but really different, which is a really surprising finding. And then what we actually started to go back and look through the data, and we found this isn't, there's something, let me back up a second, there's something called a turnover rate, right? So when they eat these things, it's not instantly assimilated into that signature. It takes a few months. So when we started looking at the turnover rate in these tissues, we found that these are actually reflective of the mother's position. So we can use this information to say, okay, these guys are occurring in the same place, but their parents aren't. So pretty cool. So what's keeping these two species distinct is likely that these Carolina hammerheads are occurring in a different place. And looking at their carbon signature, it's more depleted, so these Carolina hammerheads are likely occurring further offshore. So that's likely why we have two species. And hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to tag some of these guys. Unfortunately, you have to stick a tag on them, run the genetics, and then hope you get one. We tagged 4 scalloped hammerheads last year, and we missed a Carolina hammerhead by 1 shark. Tagged the wrong shark. So we're going to keep trying, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to figure out where these are occurring, because we know the Carolina hammerheads are coming close to shore to drop their pups, but then they're likely doing something completely different. At the same time, we can use this stable isotope tool to look at entire communities. There's a lot going on here because this is an entire community of predatory fish in Bulls Bay, South Carolina. Everything from red drum to cow-nose rays to bonnet-head sharks, Atlantic sharp-nosed sharks, flounder. And what we see is that there's a lot going on here in the middle, right? But then here on the outside, we get these individual species that pop out. And these are our prey specialists. They specialize on 1 or 2 types of prey, and that's why they have this really unique signature. So over here in the red, we have fine-tooth sharks. These guys eat 99% Atlantic menhaden, one single species of forage fish. So they have this really unique signature over here. Down here you have cow-nose rays, which tend to eat clams and mussels and things like that. Very different signature. These are juvenile red drum. These guys tend to specialize on fiddler crabs at that life stage. And then you got a lot overlapping. And what this tells us is that if we ever have a problem, if let's just say our population of menhaden collapses, our population of fine-tooth sharks is going to be in a lot of trouble as well, right? And this is something that we're really trying to do as scientists to move forward with something called ecosystem-based management, where we're not managing one species, we're managing as many as we can. And this is the kind of information that we really need to have in order to be able to do this. So one of my favorite things is movement ecology, and we've done a lot of that. And especially thanks to more than a few people in the room, we've been able to do some of our tiger shark research. But we tag animals with a lot of different types of tags. We tag them with these conventional tags. This is an acoustic tag. This is a pop-off satellite tag. This is a spot tag. They all give us different kinds of information. They all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. These acoustic tags can last for 10 years, but you only get data if they swim within about 200 meters of an acoustic receiver. If you're in the open ocean, 1,000 meters, but then you have to go get that receiver and download it. These spot tags are absolutely wonderful, and this is, if you've seen the OSearch site and followed the white sharks, this is what's on those guys. These are great, but the only information they give you is the location of the animal, and they only give it to you if the fin actually comes out of the water. These pop-off satellite tags are great. They're pretty expensive. They record a ton of information. You can get over 1 million data points from one of these, but they don't give you great location information. They're accurate to within about 100 miles, which if you're in the open ocean, 100 miles is pretty good. And if you string together enough of those 100-mile points, you can get a really good idea of the animal. But each has their weakness, and there's a different reason we use each. So one of the least respected sharks, which I absolutely love, I did my master's research on this species. In fact, I hate to say it, but this knife was out because this is the longest bonnethead that we had ever recaptured. It had been 10 years since we tagged it, and I was kind of waiting in the background to kill it. But we've been tagging these guys for a long time, and at some point we started looking at the data, and we said we're not really getting a lot of recaptures except exactly where we tagged them, which is unusual for sharks. We expect them to move in and out of different rivers. So we actually went and started analyzing the data, and each one of these points here represents a recapture. So over here we have how long it's been in the wild since we tagged it, 500,000 days. And then over here we have our two primary locations where we tagged these bonnethead sharks, Bulls Bay and North Edisto River. And these little brackets are animals that were tagged and recaptured on the same exact day. So we tagged them, and let's say for these two, almost 1,500 days later, we recaptured them on the same exact day. And when we analyzed these data, we found that not a single shark tagged in the North Edisto River was captured in Bulls Bay, and the opposite. So these guys, they're not only coming back to the same river every year, they're not really even going to any other river. So that's really high site fidelity for a shark species. So we decided to do a follow-up study with our acoustic telemetry. This is a perfect candidate species. So we can put these acoustic receivers in this river and really get an idea of what these animals are doing. And what we found is that this is the first year we tagged these animals, and we tagged them in the fall, and water temperatures dropped, and they migrated down here to Brunswick, and it was actually a really warm winter, right? So these guys, which display incredible, this site fidelity, one animal went down here to Canaveral, but all the rest of them stayed in these nearshore waters off of Brunswick. As soon as the water temperatures warm, they came back up, and they spent almost the entire summer in the North Edisto River. Some of them were detected on these receivers here to the south, but they generally, all of them came back to the river. And then the following year, within 1 day of when they left the previous year, all of them left the river and migrated down. But this year it was a cold year. I think, winter of 2017, we had some real cold temperatures, and they breathed, they kind of hung here and said, nope, too cold, we're going all the way down here. And then once again, as soon as it warmed up, they were back in the river for the following summer. And then within a day again of when they left the previous year, all of them left and went straight down. So what we see with these animals is this incredibly high site fidelity to this river, but at the same time, temperature-driven migration. So two different behaviors in these animals. So they're not, they're not displaying site fidelity to their overwintering grounds. They only go as far as they have to go. but they are displaying site fidelity to this river system. And this will be, this is one of these species that as water temperatures warm, it will be really interesting to follow. And at the same time, as I talked about prey and prey depletion before, bonnetheads eat about 99% blue crabs. They're a blue crab specialist. If for some reason the blue crab population in the North Edisto River was wiped out, we could lose, our population of bonnetheads. So, we see these really, it's pretty cool for a shark species to display this high site fidelity. It's similar to the salmonids that you see. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Oh, I'm talking too long. Our tiger sharks, this was a pet project and that we started, and as I said, some people in this room helped get this thing going, and we got some really cool results. So, this all came about because a fisherman that works down in Port Royal Sound, and at the same time, we had started sampling down there, and we were catching these huge tiger sharks. And tiger sharks aren't known as a species that really comes into estuarine waters. And here they are in these sounds, and there's a lot of them. And I got really interested by this, and I started looking at some of the data that was out there. And there had been a recently published paper that showed these areas that are kind of in these hashes were the most important areas for tiger sharks in the entire Atlantic Ocean. And I said, well, we got a lot of tiger sharks and we're getting a lot of recaptures. I think there's something going on here. Let's tag some of these guys and look at what they're doing. And lo and behold, we tagged them, and the only area that we really overlapped with was right here off of North Carolina. Unfortunately, our satellite tags that we were using, the tiger sharks were actually sabotaging them a little bit. They'll swim to the bottom and they'll rub them on the sand to try to dislodge them. So we didn't get, as long of results. We didn't get them returning. We have winter results, but they're from different sharks. And what we found was over the winter, they actually came down to this shared area, but then they went back up to a completely different area than these other sharks. So we found even within a species like the tiger shark that can migrate 10,000 miles, there's different potential subpopulations within the Atlantic. As you can see, these waters right off here on the continental shelf of South Carolina are really important to these animals. And as they migrate up, they don't really leave the shelf versus these other animals here, which they tend to do these big loops out into the Atlantic Ocean. So even in a really large species like that, there can be, different behaviors and different subpopulations, which is pretty cool. White sharks, everybody's favorite. They certainly take all the news headlines. 10 years ago, we thought white sharks were open ocean animals that occasionally came to the coast. That's changed a little bit. As you can see, the coast is hidden underneath of all of these white shark tracks, and this was probably, I think I pulled this a year ago, and since then we have even more data. But really what we found is that, again, even within these white sharks, we might have multiple populations. Those searchers started doing some work off of Nova Scotia and found that all of the animals overwinter down here, but some come up and hang out off of Massachusetts, and some come up and hang out off of Nova Scotia, and they don't really interact. So they have different foraging areas in the summer, but are sharing a foraging area in the winter. It's a good thing for us. These guys, they heavily patrol our coast, but only Canadians are swimming this time of year, so that's okay. As I was talking, post-release mortality, I promise I'm getting to the end. Post-release mortality, this is something we've really started doing the last couple of years. Going out with fishermen or going out with commercial fishermen, we let them catch the fish, we draw some blood so we can look at stress levels. We tag the animal with one of our tags that we can use to assess the fate, and then we say, okay, put the animal back in the water. We do it really quickly, so we try not to bias the results. And then we get these cool data. So this is from one of those pop-off satellite tags. And the red is water temperature, the green is pressure, which equates to depth. So you can see this animal's moving up and down in the water column. And then the blue is actually light levels. So as the sun rises, we pick up light, and then it disappears, we pick up light. And we can say from this that shark survived, right? It's swimming, light's doing what it's supposed to, temperature's about normal. It fluctuates a little bit as they swim up and down. And then we get one like this where we said, so this guy, he was swimming up and down in the water column, and then all of a sudden the signal, the light completely disappeared and the swimming signature completely changed. And then 3 days later, hey, the light turned back on right here, and the tag pops to the surface and the temperature gets a little more variable. And what we figured, this was on a 6-foot blacktip, and this 6-foot blacktip got eaten by our bigger shark. He was out there swimming, and he was probably pretty stressed out from the capture event. He's swimming a little erratically, and either a big bull shark or a big great hammerhead or something decided to eat him, tags and all. So this one did not survive the capture event. So kind of, getting towards wrapping things up, I always try to include a conservation theme. Why should we care about sharks? Well, they serve more than a role. Their role as a predator is really to keep the ocean ecosystem in balance. They keep our populations healthy. A few years ago we had dead dolphins, that had big bites out of them washing up on the beach. Well, those dolphins had a virus that was spreading around the populations. The sharks eat those sick ones. They keep that virus from spreading, right? So they're keeping the overall populations of their prey actually healthier by removing weak or injured fish. And each species, as I showed, has a niche, right? They have certain preys, and if we remove that, we don't know what the effects to that prey is. We don't know what the effects to the overall ecosystems are. Here within the U.S., though, our shark fleet is really highly regulated. Even within South Carolina, we have very few commercial shark fishermen, but globally, there's major problems with overfishing. And I'll talk about, I've got one more, slide along those lines later. I always throw in a shark attack slide. We haven't had a fatality in South Carolina since 1852, so we're doing pretty good. We average about 4 bites a year, and I call them bites because most of the time somebody, it's a grab and release where the shark is clearly mistaken what they were trying to bite. Florida has some more serious bites, and that's largely because their sharks, they don't have these big sounds like we do. Most of our big sharks are on a big sounds. In Florida, they don't really have sounds like that, so the large sharks are actually stacked up along the beaches. That's where most of the prey is. They have more serious interactions than we do. Worldwide, there's an average of about 67 bites per year. If you think about how many people in the water, it's an incredibly rare occurrence. And even white sharks, which are the most feared, there's been 69 fatal white sharks in the last 450 years. So not really something we need to be concerned with. And of course, most of our, a large portion, 30% of our bites that we do get are provoked where somebody, is messing with the shark. I threw this slide in at the last minute just because I'm a big proponent for our recreational and commercial fisheries. And our shark fisheries, as I showed with that blacktip slide, are doing really well. And we want to promote sustainable fishing in fisheries where it exists. There's currently some efforts to put in fin ban cells. And what I should preface is finning of sharks is not allowed in the U.S. However, it does occur globally. But commercial fishermen, if they land a shark, they're allowed to sell the fins. And it's actually one of the most valuable products off of the shark. So a good portion of their funds come from those fins, but the shark's dying anyways. So there's some efforts to ban the sales of those fins, and that would really hurt our commercial fishermen. In fact, our fishery would probably go away. There's been a recent paper that came out that said, really put some bad information out there and said 80% of the sharks in the U.S. haven't been assessed, but that's really not true. In fact, of the species that are fished, 94% are doing great. 4.6% are unknown, and that's because we don't have enough data to actually assess them. And there's this very small percentage, 1.6%, and that's primarily two species, dusky sharks and great hammerhead sharks that are actually overfished. So, you know, people that are promoting it, you know, they have the right idea, but they're going to hurt our fishermen without really any conservation gains, you know, because the U.S. is already the most well-regulated fishery in the world. If we take away their ability to sell fins, you know, the market is still there. Those fins are going to come from illegal fisheries where they aren't well regulated. So, you know, we're just trying to get the word out that it's, you know, while, you know, we don't ever want to see animals, you know, killed for no reason, and certainly we don't want commercial fishermen killing them just for the fins. But, you know, in all these fisheries, they're actually selling the meat too, and we would hate for our fishermen to lose out on an economic opportunity. With that, I'm finally to questions. Oh no, I was right on time. That's yeah, okay. I think we started the show early. I saw it said 1:07. We're at 40 minutes. I'm good.
Yeah.
Perfect. I could have talked more.
We have time for some questions. Go ahead.
Fin sales, what do they use the fins for?
So the fins are, so the fins, fin sales. What do they use the fins for? And this is really where, if we want to tackle finning worldwide, it's all for Asian markets. And with the emergence of economies, you know, it used to be that the most wealthy people would, you know, in China and some of these markets would have these huge banquets. And shark fin soup showed that you were wealthy and you could serve this exotic dish. But with the emerging of these economies, now everybody's doing it. So it's promoted this fishery, and it sells for $100 a bowl, shark fin soup. And basically all it is the supporting tissue in the fins. And it's tasteless. It's chicken noodle soup with this tasteless stuff, but it shows that you are wealthy and you can do this. So it's really expanded, and there's been a lot of pressure within their own country. The young people are kind of bucking the trend. So we know it's something that's eventually going to go away, but ultimately, you know, as we've unfortunately learned, if there's a market for a product, it's going to get filled, and unfortunately, you know, it's been in these areas of the world where sharks are really hurting. So, you know, we want to see it go away, but, you know, we don't necessarily think, you know, taking away the whole U.S. shark fishery from commercial fishermen is the way to do it.
Question here.
What's going on Cape Cod and all the things?
So,
What's going on in Cape Cod?
Yeah, what's going on in Cape Cod? So they really are facing some challenges there. They have had an explosion in their seal population, which has led to a resurgence of white sharks in very shallow water. And this is a recipe for disaster. They have people who regularly surf in seal colonies, and white sharks are in there feeding, and you're gonna have interactions when you have the two, unfortunately. They're doing some really good work up there in terms of some of this acoustic work that I was talking about. They've tagged over a couple hundred white sharks, and they have real-time buoys in their harbors that can alert their lifeguards when these sharks enter the area, so they can close beaches, things like that, to be proactive, to keep interactions from occurring. But ultimately, as these seal populations continue to expand, you know, they're going to have more and more issues with that, and it's certainly something I don't envy them as a state agency trying to manage that.
Question over here.
Could you talk about the implications of climate change and ocean temperature on what's happening with the whole shark population?
Yeah,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah. So climate change and the implications for shark populations. That is an incredibly tough question to get at, because, you know, there's so many things that go into, you know, how sharks use environments. And ultimately, you know, a lot of what we're trying to do is quantify that. And, you know, once we have an idea of how they use different temperatures, you know, we can get at, you know, some of those predictions. Ultimately, there have been, you know, there's we've already seen shifts in some populations ranges. Things like the dusky shark used to use South Carolina as a pupping area, and now that pupping area is centered more off of North Carolina, Virginia. So we've already seen range shifts. In terms of the populations and potential effects, that's really going to be hard to get at. There's been some papers that have shown some potential effects, and certainly areas where you have coral reef dependent shark species. As our coral reefs face challenges, those shark species are going to face challenges too. But yeah, that's really going to be a future avenue of a lot of research because there's so many questions there.
They stick together?
So one of the interesting things, and I didn't mention it, but with the salmonids, it's natal driven, right? They're born there and then they come back. But in the case of bonnetheads, they're not born there. So we believe it's actually social, to where they're in these shared wintering grounds, and in their first or second year, they're latching on to another animal, they're going with them, and then once they're there, they return every year. So we believe it's a combination of magnetic migration as well as olfactory chemical migration. So some of these species occur globally, but I saw a really funny video recently off of Edisto, and it was a guy who had a few beers, and he took a spoon down into the water, and he took it, said, "Let me test if there's sharks here," and drank it. It was salt water, and he's like, "Yep, there's sharks." So if you're in salt water, there's sharks, and in a lot of cases, if you're in fresh water, there's sharks. So globally, yeah, all oceans. I would say about half of the species that we have are circumglobal, which means they occur in temperate waters worldwide. We're blessed in South Carolina to have every species that's considered dangerous to humans, but we're only averaging 4 bites a year, so we're not doing bad considering. Well, when it comes to apex, there's no more apex than a killer whale. And they have been found to prey on white sharks. In fact, for a couple of years off of South Africa, if you've ever watched the Discovery Shark Week, where you see the sharks leaping out of the water at the seal, that's the Mosul Bay area in South Africa. And a pod of killer whales moved in, and they started specializing in eating shark liver. And the way they did this is they would get a white shark, and one would grab one fin, and one would grab the other fin, and they would just surgically split him down the middle, and then they would eat the liver and leave the rest of the shark. So they found these white sharks were washing up with just their livers gone, and it was these killer whales. And for 3 years, white sharks completely disappeared from Mosul Bay. I've heard this year the white sharks have just started showing back up. I think that killer whale pod moved on to something a little more devious elsewhere.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have a question. I hear about large sharks swimming up rivers.
Yep.
Have you, 2,000 miles up, bull sharks up 2,000 miles up the Mississippi? Do we have sharks swimming up our rivers?
Most definitely. I haven't sampled down here. So Broad River Bridge, we've had a couple 14-foot tigers that we've tagged up to the Broad River Bridge. In the Edisto River, which is the longest blackwater river on the East Coast, we've caught bull sharks 50, 60 miles up there. There was one that was caught. It was Missouri, a bull shark that was caught in Missouri, in the Mississippi River. So those guys, they can actually completely tolerate fresh water. And there's other species of sharks that can as well.
You cannot make an industry out of shark fishing in Missouri, though. But.
No. Catfish, yes, not necessarily sharks.
Toss that out for the people that like to go out in that little John boat up the river. All right, we've run out of time, but if you have another question, I'm sure that Brian would love to answer that.
I'd be glad to.